So as I mentioned earlier, this contact and traditions of prejudice and discrimination between um, the dominant Anglo and the minority Hispanic has went on since the 19th century. The level of Latino prejudice has declined, or at least it was on the decline, but prejudice and racism against Latinos tends to increase during times of high immigration and competition for jobs and other resources, which is what we're experiencing right now. You're literally watching it on your um, PDAs and your iPads and your cell phones. It's unfolding in front of your eyes. Research shows that Hispanic groups' rates of acculturation increase with the length of residence and are higher for native born, which kind of makes sense, that first generation, second generation, third generation phenomenon. Racial factors have complicated and slowed the process of assimilation for many Latinos, though. And we see these cultural differences reflected, especially in the recent immigration groups. The more recent they immigrated, the more likely they will express cultural differences. If you looked at the concentration of Latinos in 2010, we see some regional concentrations. These concentrations are pretty much in reference to where those populations landed: Puerto Ricans Northeast, Mexicans Texas, Arizona, California. And within these groups, within these regions, Latinos are highly urbanized. Hispanics are generally less residentially segregated than African Americans, but there's still Hispanic white residential segregation, and that's held pretty steady with minor increases and decreases over time. Education, of course, is always an issue. Levels of education for Hispanic Americans have risen in recent years, but still lag behind national standards. Lower levels of education are the cumulative results of decades of systematic discrimination and exclusion. In the case of Mexican Americans, by the high percentage of recent immigrants who bring very modest educational backgrounds, we don't see much advancement. Given the role that education credentials have come to play in the job market, these figures support the idea that assimilation will be segmented and suggests that opportunities for upward mobility will continue to be limited. So, if you're immigrating to the United States, you're Hispanic and you don't have much education, your opportunities aren't going to be all that great. This chart gives an idea of how Hispanics are lagging behind non-Hispanic whites and which groups are doing the best. So, looks like the Colombians are doing the best. The Guatemalans are doing the worst. And the Mexicans aren't doing all that well either. Of course, we want to see this in reference to politics and power. The political resources available to Hispanic Americans have increased over the years, but the group still is predominantly and proportionately underrepresented. It's just reading about a push to add a question about citizenship in the 2020 census, and how during a heightened time of fear in the Hispanic community, how this question might misrepresent how many people are actually in the country. And overall, it will disproportionately affect Hispanics, because if they're undercounted, then the resources that would flow from census data analysis to underrepresented communities would decrease. Although Hispanic Americans are still underrepresented, these figures suggest that they will become increasingly important in American political life, especially as their numbers continue to grow. Even with the smaller turnout, Hispanic voters were an important part of the coalition that re-elected President Barack Obama. In competition between the Republican and Democratic Party for this growing segment of the electorate will continue. And if politics of the day are any indication of which way Hispanics are going to lean in the future, I would think that they would be more willing to listen to the positions of the Democratic Party, because they feel as if it's more inclusive for them at this time. Jobs and income are always a major place to look at or look to for signs of inequality. The economic situation of Hispanics is mixed. Some are on the upward swing, other ones are caught in low-paying jobs. The unemployment rates for Hispanic Americans run about twice the rate of non-Hispanic whites. And the poverty rates for the group as a whole are comparable to those of African Americans. As was the case with African Americans and Native Americans, Latinos are overrepresented in the lowest income categories. Cuban Americans have the lowest poverty rates and are comparable to the national norms. Mexican American and Puerto Rican families have the higher rates of poverty, especially for female-headed households, and these rates are comparable to the figures for African Americans and American Indians. If we think about this group in reference to the socioeconomic profile, Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans reflect their concentration in the low wage sector of the economy, the long tradition of discrimination and exclusion, and the lower amounts of human capital, especially education and job training, has prevented them from making significant strides in American society. Cuban Americans, buoyed by a more privileged social class background and, of course, their enclave economy, rank higher on virtually all measures of wealth and prosperity. These figures point to a split labor market which dominates this group, differentiated by gender, within the dual market differentiated by race and ethnicity. Female-headed Latino families are affected by a triple economic handicap. They have only one wage earner whose potential income is limited by discrimination against both women and Latinos. Back to jobs and income. As was the case with African Americans and Native Americans, these economic differences are even wider when we consider wealth as opposed to income. The majority of households, 57%, are in the low wealth category, and only about 26% are in the upper, middle, and high wealth categories. While some immigrant groups arrive with abundant resources, and high levels of human and financial capital, Hispanic immigrants typically arrive with little education, few skills, and often no more wealth than the clothes that they wear. That brings us to contemporary Hispanic-white relations. The extent of intimate contact between Hispanic Americans and the dominant group is probably higher than for either African Americans or Native Americans. Some studies show that contact is greater for the more affluent social classes in the cities and for the younger generations who are presumably more Americanized. Rates of intermarriage are higher for Latinos than for African Americans, but neither are a very high percentage of all marriages. Black and white interracial couples make up less than 1% of all marriages, and the comparable figure for Latinos is 4% of all marriages. So as test cases for what we have called the traditional view of American assimilation, Latinos fare poorly, as there is no single experience or pattern of adjustment to the larger society. Their experiences also illustrate some of the fundamental forces that shape minority group experiences. 1, the split labor market and the U.S. appetite for cheap labor. 2, the impact of industrialization. 3, the dangers of a permanent urban underclass. 4, the relationships between competitions and the levels of prejudice and rejection. And finally, number 5, the persistence of race as a primary dividing line between people and groups. So even though Hispanics have received less severe treatment than we found with Native Americans and African Americans, as far as the sheer brutality that was brought to them as they made their way to the United States, as they immigrated to the United States, they still fall into the same socioeconomic categories, human capital categories, and political power categories. So we'll see how that changes over the next 25 years. But right now, their numbers are rising, but it's unclear whether their power will follow suit.